A pharmaceutical company is about to release a breakthrough heart medication. But there's a catch. It could cause strokes 5 times more frequently. And they know it. Ava Carter, the only scientist who uncovered the truth, tried to warn them. But instead of listening, the company threatened, fired her, and tried to destroy her. They thought she would stay silent. But Ava remembered the words of Martin Luther King Jr. The first step in solving a problem is recognizing that there is one. If she doesn't speak out, thousands could die. What will she do? Can Ava alone take down this corrupt corporation? Watch now to uncover the truth. The fluorescent light overhead cast a cold, sterile glow, tinting Ava Carter's brown skin with a ghostly hue. The lab was so quiet she could hear the rhythmic clatter of a keyboard, punctuated by the slow drip of coffee into a glass cup beside her. Steam curled upward, fogging the edges of her glasses. She pushed them up the bridge of her nose, eyes locked onto the computer screen. She had gone over this data a dozen times, yet the numbers refused to change. The test group taking Cardiovex, heart medication her company was about to release, had a stroke rate 5 times higher than the control group. How was that possible? She scrolled through the files, checking each dataset for errors, but the calculations were solid. Her heartbeat slowed, a creeping unease settling into her spine. This couldn't be right. Previous studies had shown Cardiovex to be safe. If these results were accurate, millions of patients could be at risk. Ava leaned back in her chair, gripping the edge of the desk. A question echoed in her mind. Was this just a statistical anomaly? Or something far worse? She took a steadying breath and reached for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled through her contacts, searching for Dr. Malcolm Reed, the IE head of research. If anyone knew what was going on, it was him. But before she could dial, the lab door swung open. Malcolm Reed stepped inside, a cup of black coffee in hand. He was a man in his 50s, his graying hair slicked back, his sharp, gray eyes carrying the weight of someone accustomed to making hard decisions. "Dr. Carter," he greeted, his voice low, laced with fatigue. "You're here late." Ava turned her screen toward him. "I think we have a problem with the Cardiovex trial data." Reed glanced at the numbers. His expression didn't change, but Ava caught the brief flicker of tension in his eyes. "Maybe you misread something," he said, his tone carefully neutral. Ava frowned, pulling the screen back toward herself and enlarging the data set. "No, the stroke rate in the Cardiovex group is 5 times higher than in the placebo group. I've checked and rechecked. This isn't a minor statistical fluctuation." Reed set his coffee down, crossing his arms. "Ava, you're overreacting. This is a massive opportunity for us. Don't sabotage it." She froze. "Sabotage?" Reed sighed. "The way one might when speaking to a stubborn child? Do you have any idea how much we've invested in Cardiovex? Hundreds of millions of dollars. If you take this report outside these walls, you'll destroy a project we've spent over a decade developing." Ava stared at him. Something was wrong. Reed wasn't surprised. He wasn't even pretending to be. The unease in her gut sharpened. "You already knew, didn't you?" Her voice was quiet, but every word landed with a heavy weight. Reed didn't answer right away. Instead, he lifted his cup, took a slow sip, and watched her. Measuring her. "Ava," he said at last, his voice calm, deliberate. "I strongly suggest you let this go. Your job is to keep doing your work and let the board handle the rest." Ava's breath hitched. The realization was sinking in. She had just stepped into a game where everyone else already knew the rules. We can't ignore this. She pushed back her chair, standing abruptly. If CardioVex is dangerous, we have to report it to the FDA. Reed set his cup down. The FDA won't care about a few statistical outliers. They need to see a bigger benefit than risk. Ava let out a sharp, humorless laugh. And what about the patients? Reed arched an eyebrow. Do you really think everyone shares your sense of ethics? A chill ran through her. This wasn't a scientific debate anymore. This was a confrontation. She clenched her fists. I won't stay silent. Reed sighed, shaking his head. Think carefully, Ava. Then he walked out, leaving her alone with the damning numbers on her screen. Ava looked down at her hands. They were still shaking. For the first time in her career, she realized she could no longer trust the people she had dedicated over a decade of her life to. And this was only the beginning of the nightmare. The air in the lab felt suffocating. Ava sat frozen in her chair, the glow of the computer screen casting a cold, eerie blue across her face. The numbers on the data report flickered like warning signals, but they weren't what made her chest tighten. It was Malcolm Reed's final words before he walked out. Think carefully, Ava. It wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, dark brown eyes narrowing in suspicion. If Reed hadn't been surprised by the data, it meant he had known all along. But what did that imply? Had the company been aware of this for months and chosen to bury it? She swallowed hard, a bold thought forming in her mind. She needed to check the internal system, which meant hacking into the company's database. For a second, she hesitated. If she did this and got caught, her career would be over. But if she didn't, millions of patients could be unknowingly walking into danger. Her fists clenched. There was no turning back. A.M., the lab, was a vacuum of silence. Her colleagues had long since gone home, leaving only the hum of machines filling the empty space. Ava checked the security logs one last time. No sign of activity. No one watching. Then she opened her laptop. The company's internal database was shielded by layers of security. But Ava wasn't a stranger here. She had worked for this corporation for over a decade, long enough to understand its systems. With the right approach, a little patience, and some technical maneuvering, she could slip through the cracks in its defenses. Her fingers moved quickly over the keyboard, entering a series of commands she never thought she'd have to use. Her heart pounded as the system began decrypting files. 1 minute passed. 2. Then the screen flashed, and a list of documents appeared. Ava clicked on a file titled Clinical Analysis Report, CardioVex, January 6 months ago. She opened it, and her blood ran cold. Right in front of her was a fully detailed report from 6 months ago, explicitly outlining CardioVex's stroke risks. A bolded line at the top of the document made her stomach drop. Unusually high stroke rates in test patients. Mortality risk increased by 480% compared to placebo. They knew. 6 months ago, the company's executives were fully aware of the drug's dangers, and instead of halting the trial, what had they done? Her eyes darted to the bottom of the report. Short, chilling note. Proceed with project. Adjust data to minimize concerns. Focus on benefits over risks. Ava clamped a hand over her mouth, stifling a shaky breath. She had hoped, prayed, that this was some kind of mistake, a research error that could be corrected. But the truth was far worse. They had deliberately covered it up. Now she understood why Reed hadn't been shocked, why he had warned her not to ruin their opportunity. They had chosen profit over human lives. Ava felt as if she'd been punched in the gut. Everything she had believed in, the integrity of this company, the ethics of science, the idea that they were working towards something good, was crumbling before her eyes. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the ceiling, a single question, repeating in her mind. What the hell was she supposed to do now? Out in the hallway, a shadow moved. A security camera shifted slightly, its lens panning over the lab, capturing Ava's face illuminated by the screen, her expression frozen in shock. Somewhere, on the other side of the surveillance system, someone was watching her, and they knew exactly what she had found. The air in Ava's office grew stifling the moment she uncovered the confidential report. The cold, merciless numbers burned into her mind like an unspoken indictment. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat motionless in her chair, fingers pressing against her temples as her thoughts spun into a relentless storm. If she exposed this data, what would happen? The company would undoubtedly try to bury it. But if she stayed silent, how many lives would be sacrificed for the greed of those at the top? Morning arrived before she found an answer, along with an email from Oliver Hastings, the company's CEO, Dr. Carter. An important meeting at 10 a.m. Conference room, 42nd floor. No explanation, no subject line, but Ava didn't need one. They knew. 10:02 a.m. Conference room, 42nd floor. The glass doors shut behind Ava as she stepped inside. The room was vast yet minimalist. A long, polished walnut table gleamed under the soft glow of recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed a breathtaking view of New York City, bright and alive in the distance. At the center of the room sat Oliver Hastings, the most powerful man in the pharmaceutical industry, a man who held millions of lives in his hands with nothing more than a signature. At 52, he exuded the confidence of a seasoned businessman, his tailored suit impeccable, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back, his ever-present smile, controlled and calculated, never reaching his eyes. He gestured toward the chair across from him. "Sit, Ava." She did, but she didn't look away. Her gaze locked onto him, searching. On the table in front of him was a single cup of coffee. No files, no reports. He didn't need them. This meeting wasn't about documents. It was about her. Hastings tapped his fingers against the wood, slow, deliberate beats measuring time. "You're a brilliant scientist, Ava," he said, his voice smooth, composed. "But brilliance isn't enough. You need to know when to stop." Ava's hands curled into fists on her lap. "If you're talking about the Cardiovex report, then this isn't something that can just stop. We're talking about a drug that could kill people." Hastings tilted his head slightly, as if entertained by her words. "You're overreacting. This is business, Ava. Every drug has side effects. No one is forcing patients to take it." Ava leaned forward, her voice quiet but razor-sharp. "You knew about this risk 6 months ago. The company didn't just cover it up. You manipulated the data to deceive the FDA. That's not business. That's a crime." A brief silence. Hastings watched her, his smile unwavering, but something in his gaze darkened. "Your choices matter, Ava," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I know you're a woman of principles, but principles won't help you survive in this world." Ava let out a cold laugh. "I don't care about surviving in your world. I care about the truth." Hastings exhaled, setting his hand flat on the table. "You're smart, Ava, but don't mistake courage for recklessness." A chill ran through her. He hadn't raised his voice. hadn't issued a direct threat. But every word was laced with something far more dangerous. A warning. She braced her hands against the table, her stare unflinching. "If you think I'll stay silent, you've underestimated me." Hastings chuckled softly, then rose to his feet. "Well then," he murmured, straightening his cufflinks, "I suppose we'll be seeing each other again very soon." And with that, he walked out, leaving Ava alone with one undeniable truth. She had just declared war on the most powerful man in the pharmaceutical industry. Ava stood inside the elevator, her back pressed against the glass panel, fists clenched tight. The chime for the 22nd floor rang, but she didn't step out. Everything beyond those doors, the cold, sterile hallways, the wary glances, the hushed whispers just out of earshot, but undoubtedly about her, had changed since her meeting with Oliver Hastings. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. "I need an ally." The elevator kept rising, finally stopping on the 27th floor. Ava stepped out, moving quickly toward the research division. Inside, work continued as if nothing had happened. But Ava knew better. They had heard something. The way they avoided her gaze, the way conversations died the moment she walked past. It all told her the same thing. She was now a threat. 11:45 a.m. Dr. Patel's office. Ava knocked 3 times. Inside, Dr. Sanjay Patel, one of the company's senior clinical researchers, looked up from his computer. His face was tense, but the moment he saw her, he forced a mask of composure over his features. "Ava," he greeted, voice measured. "What can I do for you?" She stepped inside and shut the door behind her. "We need to talk." Patel glanced at the window, as if weighing whether this conversation should even happen. Finally, he exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "This is about Cardiovex, isn't it?" Ava nodded. "I know you've seen the irregular data. I found a report from 6 months ago, proof that the company knew about the stroke risk and kept pushing forward anyway." Patel's grip tightened around the pen in his hand. "Ava." He hesitated, then dropped his gaze to the desk, voice lowering to a whisper. "I'm telling you, let this go. This isn't something you can change." The words hit like a punch to the chest. "You knew?" Her voice wavered. "And you said nothing?" Patel closed his eyes, rubbing a hand down his face. "Do you think I want this? But I have a family, Ava. I can't risk my career." Ava's frustration boiled over. What about the patients? What about the people who will die because of this drug? Patel met her gaze, exhaustion written across his face. "Do you really think you can save them like this?" She froze. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Patel pushed back his chair and walked to the door. He opened it, his expression resigned. "I'm sorry, Ava. I can't help you." The room felt airless. Ava swallowed hard, then stepped out without another word. 12:30 p.m. Corporate cafeteria. Ava set her tray down at an empty table, trying to appear composed, but the weight in her chest pressed heavier with each passing second. At the next table over, a group of colleagues spoke in hushed tones. They didn't look at her, but she knew they were aware of her presence. One of them, Lisa Morales, a data analyst Ava had worked with before, lifted her gaze briefly. There was pity in her eyes. Ava leaned forward. "Lisa." Lisa flinched, glancing around as if afraid someone might be watching. She lowered her voice. "Ava, you can't win this," she whispered. "Think about your future." Ava's breath caught. "Do you even understand what they're doing, Lisa? They're playing with people's lives." Lisa swallowed hard, but didn't respond. Ava pressed her palms against the table, voice dropping to a near growl. You have a family. If someone you love needed heart medication, would you let them take Cardiovex? Lisa's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. The answer was clear. Ava inhaled sharply, disappointment swelling in her chest. If I do nothing, I won't be able to live with myself. Lisa shut her eyes for a long moment, then gave a barely perceptible shake of her head. I'm sorry. Ava pushed back her chair and stood. She didn't say another word. As she turned away, the murmurs behind her began again. They had abandoned her. She was completely alone. The cafeteria doors shut behind her, sealing her off from the world she had once belonged to. Ava pressed her back against the door, her hands trembling. At her sides, she was standing at the most dangerous crossroads of her life. If she moved forward, she would be taking on an empire. If she backed down, she would have to live with the shame forever. She shut her eyes. No, she wasn't stopping. Outside, within, the company's surveillance system, a security camera tracked her every move. Someone was watching, and they were waiting for her to make her first mistake. 6:45 a.m. Whitmore Pharmaceuticals. Headquarters, a light drizzle fell over New York City, misting the glass facades of towering skyscrapers. Outside Whitmore Pharmaceuticals, employees hurried past one another, their black umbrellas scattered. Like ink blots against the dull gray sky, Ava stood motionless at the entrance, gripping the strap of her bag so tightly that her knuckles turned white. She knew today would be different. A heavy weight settled over her as she stepped into the lobby. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step ringing out like the slow, measured beats of a war drum. She entered the elevator and pressed her floor. The metal doors slid shut, reflecting her face back at her. Exhausted, but unwavering. 7 Shooters M, 27th floor, Clinical Research Division. The moment Ava stepped out, she felt it. The eyes. Normally, no one paid her much attention, but today, every glance lingered a second too long. Some were fleeting, others bolder, and the whispers. No, one spoke to her directly, but she could feel the murmurs, the weight of conversations that stopped the moment she passed by. Her steps slowed. She scanned the room, searching for a familiar face, some sign of solidarity. But there was none. Then she saw it. On a coworker's screen, a news headline flashed, "Scientist accused of falsifying clinical trial data." Ava felt a cold jolt down her spine. She rushed to her desk and powered on her computer. The moment the screen lit up, her inbox flooded with emails. From HR Department, Dr. Carter, please report to conference room 42A immediately. From Malcolm Reed, don't make this worse for yourself, Ava. From Lisa Morales, I'm sorry, but I can't contact you anymore. Ava's fingers clenched around her mouse. What have they done? She grabbed her phone and scrolled through the latest news alerts. Another article, just published, insider scientist allegedly manipulated clinical data to create scandal. They weren't just firing her, they were erasing her. Conference room 42A. The thick glass door shut behind Ava with a heavy click. The conference room was expansive, its soft, recessed lighting casting a deceptively calm glow. But Ava wasn't fooled. At the center of the long walnut table sat Oliver Hastings, the king on his throne. Dressed in a tailored gray suit, a neatly knotted black tie, he exuded the effortless authority of a man who decided the fates of millions with the stroke of a pen. Flanking him on either side were 2 corporate attorneys, thick folders stacked before them. Ava walked forward, but didn't sit. She wasn't staying long. Hastings smiled, but his eyes were devoid of warmth. He tapped his fingers against the table. Slow, deliberate beats. "You've gone too far, Ava." He slid a document toward her. She glanced down. Termination notice. She had expected this, but seeing it in black and white still sent a sharp pang through her chest. Hastings leaned forward. "You violated company confidentiality, accessed restricted internal files, and are now attempting to defame this organization." Ava met his gaze, fury coiling inside her. "I'm not defaming anyone. I'm exposing the truth." Hastings let out a quiet chuckle, reclining in his chair. "The truth?" His voice was almost amused. "Do you think the world cares about the truth, Ava?" He shook his head and slid another document toward her. "This ensures that no company will ever hire you again." Ava's fists tightened. "They'll believe you," she scoffed. "No one will question why I did this." Hastings shrugged. "They won't need to. We'll give them their answer." And he was right. One headline, one well-placed article, one anonymous statement from a trusted executive source. That was all it would take to destroy her career forever. Ava clenched her teeth, anger simmering beneath her skin. Hastings had the power to take everything from her, but he couldn't silence her. He studied her for a moment, then arched a brow. "Nothing to say?" Ava inhaled deeply, then reached for the termination notice and tore it in half. Hastings didn't flinch. He simply smiled, shaking his head. "You're going to regret this." Ava leaned forward, pressing her palms against the table. "You can take my job, you can take my reputation, but you can't bury the truth forever." Hastings held her stare for a long moment before smirking. "We'll see." He gave a small nod to his attorneys. They stood, gathering their documents. Ava turned and walked out, but just as the door was closing behind her, she heard his final words, low and mocking. "Good luck out there, Ava. You're going to need it." The door shut. Ava stood alone in the empty hallway. No one came to see her off. No goodbyes. They had erased her. But this fight wasn't over. She wasn't going to let them win. 7:45 a.m. Whitmore Pharmaceuticals. Headquarters. Ava stepped out of the corporate building where she had dedicated 10 years of her life. But today, she walked away as a stranger. No title, no future, nothing left to lose. The rain had stopped, but the air was still damp and heavy. She pulled her coat tighter around her and moved aimlessly through the crowded sidewalks of New York City. Life continued as usual. People in a hurry, yellow taxis speeding by, car horns blaring, but none of it registered. All she could hear was silence. They had destroyed her. Everything she had built, her reputation, her career, her faith in science, had been crushed in a single night. No company would dare hire her now. No colleague would risk reaching out. But the worst part? Cardiovex was still going to market. Patients would take it, trust it, and some would never make it back to the hospital a second time. Ava clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms, almost drawing blood. She couldn't let this happen. Her phone buzzed. She stopped in the middle of the street, staring blankly at the screen. An unknown number. She opened the message. "I know the truth. Meet me at Liberty Cafe. 10 p.m. Her pulse quickened. She typed back swiftly. "Who is this?" The typing bubbles appeared, then a reply. "Ethan Liu. I think you'll want to talk to me." Ava froze. She knew that name. Ethan Liu, an investigative journalist notorious for exposing corruption in the healthcare industry. A man who had taken on giants before. And now, he was looking for her. She stared at the message, her breath unsteady. A door had just opened, a chance to bring the truth to light, or a step toward something far more dangerous. Ava shoved her phone into her pocket, pulled up her hood, and headed for the subway. This wasn't over. Sound 30 Dion Firin Fivine. High 5 p.m. Liberty Cafe. Ava stepped into the small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of East Manhattan. Inside, the glow of warm yellow lights softened the worn wooden tables, and the scent of fresh coffee lingered in the air. It wasn't crowded, but there were just enough patrons to provide a layer of background noise, enough for secrecy, but not isolation. She kept her hood low, moving carefully between the tables. In the far corner, near the window, sat a man in his early 30s, wearing glasses, his short black hair neatly trimmed. A cup of untouched espresso sat in front of him. Ethan Liu. He looked up as she approached. No small talk, just a brief nod. Ava slid into the chair across from him, removing her coat, her gaze sharp and guarded. Ethan glanced around once, then spoke quickly. "You've caught the attention of people you shouldn't mess with." Ava folded her arms. Her voice was steady, cold. "What do you want?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "The real question is, what do you want?" Ava gritted her teeth. "I want the world to know the truth." Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good." He reached into his bag, pulling out a laptop. "I've been watching Whitmore Pharmaceuticals for a while. I have sources inside, but I need solid proof. I need you to confirm what I suspect." Ava's eyes narrowed. "What do you know?" Ethan turned his screen toward her, revealing a string of emails. "Hastings and Reed didn't just cover up the data," he said. "They bribed FDA officials to fast-track approval. This is one of the biggest medical frauds in history." Ava's heart pounded. Ethan met her gaze. "I can help you, but I need you to work with me. Do you have anything that can prove this?" Ava hesitated for only a second. She did. The files she had downloaded before she was fired, still tucked inside the USB drive in her coat pocket. But before she could answer, a shiver crawled up her spine. Someone was watching. She glanced toward the window. Near the cafe's bar, a man in a dark coat sat with a notebook in front of him. But he wasn't writing. Ava swallowed hard. He was tracking them. She turned back to Ethan. He had already noticed, but remained composed. "How much time do we have?" Ava murmured. Ethan took a slow sip of his espresso, his eyes never leaving the man in the dark coat. "Not much. If they're already following you, they won't let you walk away easily." Ava exhaled, her mind sharpening. There was no turning back. She thought of a quote her father used to tell her, a line from Martin Luther King Jr. "The first step toward change is recognizing that something is wrong." She had recognized it, and she wasn't staying silent. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out the USB and slid it across the table. "Here's your proof." Ethan picked it up, his expression hardening. "Then, get ready, Ava." She took a deep breath. This time, they wouldn't be able to bury the truth. She had started this fight, and she was going to finish it. 12:30 a.m. Ava's apartment. Ava slammed the door shut behind her, her hands still trembling slightly as she locked the deadbolt. She flipped the light switch, and the warm yellow glow filled her small apartment. But it did nothing to chase away the unease coiled tightly around her chest. The meeting with Ethan Liu hours ago had changed everything. She had handed him the USB, the single most damning piece of evidence against Whitmore Pharmaceuticals. Falsified clinical trials, email exchanges between Oliver Hastings and FDA officials, proof of bribery that had fast-tracked CardioVex's approval. There was nothing left for her to lose. Only one step remained: She had to go public. Ava moved to her desk and powered on her laptop. The screen flickered to life, illuminating her tense expression. She opened the folder containing the documents, the hard proof they had tried so desperately to bury. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Then, they slowed. She knew she was about to cross a line, and once she did, there would be no turning back. The moment she hit post, her life would never be the same. Ava shut her eyes. Her breath shook slightly, but in the back of her mind, she heard her father's voice, steady, unwavering, a memory from her childhood. Don't be afraid, Ava. Justice has no voice unless people like you speak up. She opened her eyes. No more hesitation. No more fear. Ava launched her video recording software and adjusted the webcam. On the screen, her face stared back at her, her dark curls slightly disheveled, deep shadows beneath her eyes from too many sleepless nights. But in them burned a fire that refused to die. She took a deep breath and hit record. 1 a.m. The red light blinked. Ava stared directly into the camera, her voice steady and sharp. My name is Ava Carter. I was a clinical researcher at Whitmore, Pharmaceuticals. She paused, letting the words sink in. They wanted me to stay silent, but I refused to let innocent people die for their greed. Ava reached for a thick folder and placed it in front of the camera. She flipped through the pages, revealing bolded headlines, damning statistics. This is proof that Whitmore Pharmaceuticals knew about CardioVex's stroke risks 6 months ago and covered it up. They didn't just falsify trial data, they bribed FDA officials to secure approval. She pulled up an email on the screen, an internal message from Hastings to an FDA contact. Focus on the benefits. Downplay the risks. Ava's voice hardened. This isn't a mistake. This is a crime. She inhaled, pressing forward. Patients with heart disease will trust this drug. They won't know that every pill they take could be a death sentence. She held the camera's gaze. We can't let this happen. Every word was deliberate, unshakable. If you're a doctor, a scientist, a patient, or just a person with a conscience, share this video. Make them answer for what they've done. Ava stared at the upload button. Her hands no longer trembled. She clicked it. The video went live. 3:15. Amava sat frozen in her chair, eyes locked on the screen. The view count skyrocketed. 2 million. Have a million. 3 million. Thousands of comments flooded in, hundreds more every second. This is the biggest medical scandal in history. We need an investigation. Now. If this is true, Whitmore Pharmaceuticals needs to be held accountable. How did the FDA let this happen? Ava exhaled, but it wasn't relief. The real battle was just beginning. Her phone buzzed nonstop. A text from Ethan. Lou, Ava. You just did what no one else dared to do. Stay safe. This is about to explode. She opened Twitter. Justice for Ava was trending. Major news outlets, CNN, The New York Times, Reuters, had picked up the story. Then, exactly as she had expected, an official statement from the FDA appeared. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration has launched an official investigation into CardioVex following recent allegations regarding its safety. They couldn't ignore her anymore. Ava closed her eyes. She had won the first round. Morning in New York City unfolded like any other day, but inside the headquarters of Whitmore Pharmaceuticals, chaos reigned. There were no more strategic meetings, no more rehearsed laughter from the executives. Instead, panic and fear rippled through every floor. The morning news was relentless, plastered across every screen and newspaper. CEO Oliver Hastings faces criminal charges for medical fraud. FDA launches official investigation into CardioVex. Whitmore Pharmaceutical's stock plummets. As investors flee inside the top-floor boardroom, Oliver Hastings sat motionless, eyes fixed on the screen displaying the company's collapsing stock value. The red numbers flashed relentlessly. The empire he had spent years building was crumbling before his eyes. The board had called an emergency meeting. When Hastings entered the room, the air was suffocating with tension. The same executives who once bowed to him now eyed him with cold calculation. He had no allies left. Franklin Rowe, the company's longtime attorney, slid a document across the table. His voice was steady but devoid of warmth. The board has made its decision. Effective immediately, you are being removed as CEO. Hastings's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. Absolutely not. I built this company. No one has the right to push me out. Rowe's gaze remained impassive. You are under criminal investigation. If you don't want to make things worse for yourself, I suggest you cooperate. Hastings scanned the faces in the room. No one spoke up for him. Slowly, he stood, straightened his cuffs, his expression unreadable, except for the flicker of fury in his eyes. Fine, he said, voice low, but don't think for a second that I'm going down without a fight. Then he walked out, leaving behind a company in shambles. That same day, Whitmore Pharmaceuticals announced the immediate withdrawal of CardioVex from the market. Stock prices continued their free fall, wiping out billions in mere hours. Federal Court, New York City. The courtroom was packed, the media's cameras flashing as Oliver Hastings took his place at the defendant's table. Outside, protesters lined the courthouse steps, holding signs demanding justice for the patients who had nearly fallen victim to CardioVex. Ava Carter sat in the front row. She didn't look away as the prosecution presented the evidence. Falsified clinical data, bribery emails, testimonies from silenced employees. When the trial adjourned for the day, Hastings strode past her, his face composed, but his eyes burning with resentment. He paused just long enough to murmur, "You won." This time. Ava met his gaze, silent. She knew this wasn't just her fight. People like Hastings still existed. The system would keep operating unless someone stood up to challenge it. She stepped past him, toward the courtroom doors. The sun shone bright over the city, but she knew there was still darkness ahead. 3 months later, Washington, D.C., New York, had settled into the crisp air of late autumn, but the aftershocks of the Whitmore scandal still lingered. Ava Carter was no longer just a nameless scientist in a research lab. At the National Medical Summit in Washington, D.C., she entered a conference hall filled not with corrupt executives, but with medical advocates, legal experts, and patient rights activists. A major health organization had reached out to her. They wanted her to help spearhead a new initiative, one that would fight for transparency in the pharmaceutical industry, ensuring that no corporation could ever bury the truth for profit again. As she stepped up to the podium at an international conference, camera flashes flickered across the room. A journalist stood up and raised a hand. "Do you believe justice has been served?" Ava hesitated for just a moment. She thought of the patients who had narrowly escaped CardioVex, the silenced employees, the others like her, those who had dared to take on the system. Then she spoke. Justice is not a moment. It is a long road, Her words spread across media platforms, inspiring thousands. Advocacy groups intensified their push for pharmaceutical reform. Companies were forced to answer for their actions. But Ava knew this was only the beginning. Today, Whitmore Pharmaceuticals had fallen. Tomorrow, another corporation would take its place, scheming just as Hastings had. She couldn't single-handedly dismantle the system, but she could start a movement, a wave that couldn't be silenced. As she stepped out of the conference hall, she was no longer just a woman fighting against a corporation. She was a symbol of truth, and she wasn't stopping. The end, but the fight continues. Thank you for following Ava Carter's journey, a battle filled with hardship, but also purpose. If you believe the truth deserves to be heard, if you want more stories that expose dark secrets and fight for justice, hit subscribe and turn on notifications today. Together, we can make a difference.